wherever you are, pick up the nearest item to you and keep it in your hand. If it's a pen, if it's a coin, if it's a piece of paper, pick up the nearest item to you and keep it in your hand. I'm going to name some names. When you hear a name you do not recognize, put the item down. Remember, when you hear a name that you don't recognize, put the item down. Ready? George Floyd, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. Still got the item in your hand? Let's keep going. Takaya Young, Makai Bryant. Still got your item in your hand? Let's keep going. Michelle Cusseau, Aura Russer, Tanisha Anderson, Maya Hall, Natasha McKenna. All right, if you still have the item in your hand, go ahead and put it down. I have a feeling that very few of you still have the item in your hand. So, for those of you who recognize the first set of names, you know that these were Black people who have been killed by police over the last decade or so. What you may not know is that the other list is also Black people who've been killed within roughly the same time frame. Only one thing that distinguishes the names you know from the names you don't: gender. There's nothing about you that is distinct from other people watching this video that explains the pattern of recognition I suspect happened. Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw has done what I just did with you countless times across the country. To women's rights organizations, civil rights groups, professors, students, psychologists, sociologists. She's done it with law enforcement, even with progressive members of Congress. Everywhere, the pattern that I suspect happened remains the same. The level of awareness of the amount of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low, which is somewhat surprising because there's police violence against Black people, there's violence against women. Those are two issues that are constantly talked about and have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, who is victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women don't come to mind. Our communications experts tell us that when facts don't fit within the available frames, that people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. So these women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no existing frames with which to think about them. No frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. And as a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, politicians don't build policy around them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, somebody out there might be thinking, but there's Sandra Bland, there's Breonna Taylor. Please hold the fact that Breonna Taylor was murdered in her sleep in March of 2020. And her name did not start trending until much later. And I can assure you that you are likely to be able to remember far more Black men who have been murdered by cops than Black women. And this is not without a history. Black civil rights movements are largely painted as having male leads, despite the volume of Black women who largely go unnamed and unhonored, yet they are the bedrock of civil rights successes. Now, what does that exercise have to do with Emma Grede? Are we still talking about Emma Grede? I'm so ready for this Emma Grede book tour, PR overload to be done. Emma Grede, Emma Grede, Emma Grede. All I keep hearing about is Emma Grede. Listen, actually, this isn't about Emma Grede per se, but I gotta be honest. Emma Grede just keeps giving me material to have larger conversations. So Emma Grede it is. My last Emma Grede video was about the stories we tell, what we say, what we leave out, the privileges that grant us unearned access that we aren't trained to tell. But this video, it begs the question, what happens when a Black woman uses the language or shape of marginalization, but in a way that flattens the actual stakes of intersectionality? I knew I'd eventually do a video about intersectionality because it's one of the biggest frameworks addressing what's underneath a thing, what drives a thing, what connects things. But I didn't think the video would be about Emma Grede because I've simply never used the same live wire twice. But as Emma Grede continues her book tour and her comments continue making the rounds, the phrase that came to my mind was botched intersectionality. And my brain didn't really form much beyond that at first. It didn't immediately hand me the full thing. It didn't give me the polished explanation right away. It just gave me the phrase botched intersectionality. It also gave me the phrase half-cocked, but that might be a bit too Southern and not so accessible, so I'm gonna stick with botched for this video. And when I think about it, that's often how my brain works, which is why I don't do weekly videos. It takes about a week for my brain to settle from creating one video, observe the world, and receive a download for my next video. And I've learned to pay attention when my mind does that. Because even as a kid, my mind would catch part of something before my mouth had the language for it. And sometimes I know something is off before I can fully explain why it's off. And instead of forcing a half-baked explanation, I've just learned to sit with it. So I sat with it. And I realized that much of what Emma has said bothers me and other people for a lot of reasons, a lot of obvious reasons. But another thing that stayed with me since my last video about her, besides the way she frames her story, it wasn't just that I disagreed or that she merely said something offensive. It's that she talks about women as though women are this flat category, and intersectionality exists to stop us from flattening people like that. So I kept coming back to flattened. And I kept coming back to this question of what happens when a Black woman uses this language or shape of marginalization, but in a way that flattens the actual stakes of intersectionality. Because intersectionality has stakes, and those stakes are most felt by Black women. But what Black women? Emma talks about women in a way that feels too not enough for the category she is invoking. She continues to offer this flattened reading of women, work, and success. I have personally worked with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and I know for a fact that intersectionality was built to interrupt and resist exactly that kind of flattening. It was built to stop us from talking about women as though all women move through work, power, visibility, ambition, motherhood, race, and class in the same way. And if your analysis can't hold that, then something has gone terribly left. For one thing, representation is not the same thing as intersectionality. And identity is not an analysis. More on both of those later in this video. But I'm going to just start by saying that a Black woman speaking is not automatically an intersectional analysis. Because a statement can sound broad, it can sound unsugar-coated, while still being too flat to hold the people most affected by the systems that it's talking about. Let me be very candid. It's often the Emma Gredes of the world that are used as the face of intersectionality. Think back to when George Floyd died, and there was this uptick in DEI officers. And often those DEI officers was of the Emma Grede type. Even if they weren't women, they talked real good, and to an untrained ear, they sounded real good. The minute a Black woman is speaking, especially in public, especially with some power, especially with polish, people can start acting like her perspective is automatically intersectional. And she is often used as the face for DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I don't like that. You got to be real careful about which type of woman that you position as the face for intersectionality, the face for diversity, the face for equity, the face for inclusion. Representation and intersectionality are not the same thing. A Black woman can absolutely be marginalized. A Black woman can absolutely have experienced sexism and racism. A Black woman can have had to navigate a world built to reward proximity to whiteness, capitalism, beauty, elite performance. I'm sure Emma would say she's experienced all of that. Yet and still, that same Black woman can misuse intersectionality. She can flatten it. She can wear the optics of it without honoring the stakes of it. And she doesn't once have to say its name. And that is part of what is happening in Emma Grede's comments about work, visibility, women's success, and her most recent comments about her refusal to invest in the beauty brand Ami Coley when it was in its early stages, but then she turned around and chose to hire its founder for Skims. Girl, why you went and worked for Emma after that? When Emma says that essentially women need to be in close proximity, highly visible, and physically present in order to advance, she's not just giving career advice. She is revealing the limits of her own frame, just like the absence of a frame we saw in the opening activity. Straight up, Emma Grede's framework is not intersectional, although I'm sure she wouldn't say it isn't, or she might flat out say that it is. And today I want to talk about that frame, not just whether people were offended, but what it means when intersectionality gets discussed through the body of a Black woman without actually being embodied as a practice, or maybe too much practice and not enough embodiment, doing it, living it. There are many, many Emmas running around here. This happens a whole lot. And frankly, I think we need to get better at naming it. And for those of you saying Emma doesn't claim to be intersectional, she doesn't even use that language. Stop putting things on her that she never claimed. Agreed. And you don't get to cherry pick oppressions. You don't get to cherry pick your narrative of suffering by using the language and shape of marginalization, but in a way that flattens the actual stakes of your overlapping social identities and related systems of domination, oppression, and discrimination, which is the very definition of intersectionality. But a lot of people let too many people do this. So this wasn't even obvious to a lot of people who take the stance that she don't even use that language. You don't have to claim feminist theory for me to notice when your argument flattens women into one category. Emma Grede don't have to say intersectionality out loud for me to recognize when her analysis is too flat to hold women properly. If you are still here, thank you. Stick around, because I'm not done. We're about to get into intersectionality real good. But first, let me introduce myself for the people who have no clue who I am. What's up? I'm the Ignant intellectual. My birth certificate says Durandrian. I'm a writer, a storyteller, and a masterful facilitator. On this channel, my goal is to create a space for you to think about your thoughts and to provide an online home for thinkers. I do that by talking about any and everything. But what I talk about is always via one of three lenses: First, cultural autopsies. Second, framework drops. 3, bridge videos. What the hell are those? Well, cultural autopsies are where I do what autopsies do. I dissect public conversations, interviews, moments, trends to uncover the deeper things at play, to go beneath the surface and take larger conversations and look at what's really underneath a person, a moment, a trend, an interview, a scandal, a celebrity clip. And then framework drops are where I offer tools for thinking more clearly about what we're living through. They give you tools to think with. Because if you're anything like me, you sometimes feel and think some shit ain't right, but you don't always have the framework, the tool, or the language to articulate why some shit ain't right. And bridge videos connect things that people usually keep separate and show how they're actually related. I'm interested in what happens when we put two things in conversation that don't usually get discussed together, like prostitution and spirituality, or being a sex worker and a Christian, or being transgender and having a relationship with God. These videos are about naming the connection, the tension, and the meaning of that sometimes messy middle. This video today is a framework drop. But as with most framework drops, there's also some cultural autopsying as well. So don't click off the video before we get to the framework and its tools and the part autopsy and dissection. Now remember, as with all of my videos, you don't have to agree with me, but at least know why you think what you think, especially if you're going to get in my comments and disagree with me. Now I know that this stuff I talk about can bring about a lot of different reactions, and I actually don't expect everyone to agree with me. So be clear, you get to disagree with me, but there are rules of engagement. This is not a democracy. Rule of engagement number 1. You must have watched the video completely in order to disagree with me. I'm not going to be entertained and I ain't watched the whole thing but as people. And trust me, I'm going to ask you in the comments, did you watch the whole video? And one reason being is that often the things that people disagree with are things that I wrestle with in the video. Rule of engagement number 2. You must have thought about your thoughts and why you disagree. This entire channel is about thinking about your thoughts. So if you have a thought, cool. If you haven't thought about your thought, Rule of engagement number 3. Use moments of discomfort to inquire deeper. Again, I know the stuff that I talk about can bring about a lot of different reactions. So at minimum, watch the whole video. Think about your thoughts before quickly jumping in the comments with certain heated responses. And lastly, use any moment you feel discomfort to go inward and think about why you might be uncomfortable. All right, what is intersectionality? Well, let's see how the person who coined the theory defines it. Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, civil rights advocate and law professor. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989. She introduced the concept in her University of Chicago Legal Forum article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. And the purpose of this was to describe how Black women face unique combined discrimination from both sexism and racism. Now remember, Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, so her work centers legalities, discrimination type stuff. But listen, you ain't got to understand law to understand when racism and sexism collide to create a whole new experience of oppression, of compounding oppression. In this article, Crenshaw analyzes the Graffenreid versus General Motors to illustrate how Black women faced unique compounded discrimination that existing legal frameworks failed to address. She noted that at GM, Black women were not getting hired before 1964. Then later, when layoffs happened in the 70s, Black women were hit especially hard because of the way seniority rules worked. Well, the courts basically said, well, GM hires women and GM hires Black people. But what the court missed was that women being hired were mostly white women. And the Black people being hired were what? Black men. So who was being left out? Black women. This meant Black women were almost invisible in the law, just like Black girls were invisible in that frame in our opening activity. They simply didn't fit how the court was thinking about women or Black people. This helped Dr. Crenshaw explain why Black women can face a very specific kind of unfair treatment that is not just about race and not just about gender, but that is about both race and gender. That is part of why she created the word intersectionality, because it helps explain what happens when different kinds of unfairness collide at the same time. Crenshaw illustrates how legal frameworks fail to recognize intersectional discrimination, leaving Black women excluded from both factory and administrative roles. So they couldn't get jobs on the plant floor at GM, and they couldn't get jobs in the back office as administrators. Crenshaw argues that by separating race and sex claims, the court overlooked how Black women faced compounded discrimination, unable to find employment in either sector due to company hiring policies. The case highlighted how the company's hiring practices discriminated against Black women, while courts refused to recognize a distinct category for them, forcing a choice between race or sex discrimination claims. The text explains how this legal precedent failed to protect individuals facing intersectional discrimination. Remember, the theory of intersectionality was coined by a legal scholar. One thing I'd also like to stress is that intersectionality centers Black women, full stop. not women of color, not people of color, Black women, not poor white women. Intersectionality is not a catch-all for anybody with a marginalized identity. So let's talk about what exactly is botched about what Emma Grede is saying. It's botched intersectionality because it speaks about women as though gender operates the same way across women's lives. It universalizes a path to success without accounting for very real, unequal conditions under which women are seen, judged, and promoted under the guise of just be visible. Emma's takes treat visibility like this neutral career asset instead of something different bodies experience differently. It's botched intersectionality because some bodies, when they are visible, do more harm for that individual's career trajectory than if that body was invisible. It's botched because it uses the broad category of women while skipping the layered realities that make workplace presence more costly for some women than others. It confuses representation with analysis. Emma's identity may very well signal complexity, but her argument itself flattens it. Now, before people get started with the, are you saying it's her fault that she is who she is? I even have to say that Emma is not wrong because she's privileged, and Emma's statement reveals what happens when a powerful woman speaks about women in a way that flattens the very differences intersectionality was designed to name. But I feel like I should probably say that. What people hear when a Black woman speaks is powerful. Sometimes what they hear is all their hopes and dreams embodied. And no. I think one of the trickiest things about public discourse is that people often confuse identity with an analysis. And y'all gonna hear me say this 11 times in this video. An identity does not equal an analysis. We must all develop an analysis that goes beyond our lived experience. If a Black woman is speaking, some people hear nuance and depth and marginalization, and she gets it, she understands it. And to be fair, sometimes she does, but sometimes she doesn't. Sometimes what people are actually hearing is the comfort of symbolic inclusion. They got a lot of Black women out here whose entire career goal was inclusion. They hear a Black woman and think, well, this can't be too narrow. This can't be too elitist. This can't be too disconnected from ordinary women because look at who's saying it. And baby, that's exactly how certain whitewashed ideas get smuggled in under the cover of representation. Remember this, you don't need one single white body in a room for white supremacy to be running the meeting. So when she says something about women and work, a lot of people don't just hear a rich person talking. They hear a rich Black woman talking, and that changes the entire emotional reception. It can make people less likely to immediately question the exclusions built into what she is saying. And I need us all to really, really sit with that. Because one of the most important things intersectionality asks us to do is examine how power actually works, not just who is visually present in the room. Intersectionality is not just a buzzword. It is a theory of power. Let's define it. Intersectionality, as defined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, is overlapping and intersecting social identities. And this is where most people stop. Oh, we intersectional. Oh, I'm a white woman. Oh, you're poor and disabled. Oh, we all have intersecting identities. But when I say intersectionality is a theory of power, this is the part people overlook. Intersectionality is overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of domination, oppression, and discrimination. Intersectionality calls to us to examine how power actually works. Not just who is visibly present in the room, not just who gets to be in the rooms that Emma Grede is telling us to be visible in, not just who counts as a diversity success story, as the girl who grew up in London who delivered newspapers at 12 who is now successful, but whose lived reality is being centered, whose is being erased, whose is being used to launder a much more narrow worldview than we want to admit. Intersectionality actually requires something of us. So what does intersectionality require? And I want to offer ways to know whether your own intersectional approach is botched. But let's slow down and talk for a second about what intersectionality actually requires. Intersectionality is not just a fancy way of saying multiple things can be true. It's not just we all have layers. It's not just, well, as a Black woman. This is part of why the term gets so abused. Intersectionality demands, requires us to look at what happens when systems overlap and how when they overlap in oppressive ways, the most burdened is likely going to be a Black woman. It's not just identities floating around in the abstract, race, gender, class, beauty politic, body size, caregiving responsibility. And it's not just something for you to list like a CVS receipt. It's something that calls you to ask the question, what happens when these things combine and create an entirely new experience based on those compounded systems of oppression? Words mean things. Words mean things. What happens when a Black woman is a mother? What happens when she is disabled? What happens when the black woman is dark-skinned? What happens when the black woman is both fat and highly educated? What happens when the black woman's phenotype make people say, wait a minute, she black? Who is made more vulnerable? Who is made more disposable? Who is made more visible in the wrong ways? Who is punished for this proximity that Emma Grede say we all got to acquire to? Who is ignored even when they are present? Who is hyper visible but still not protected? Who is made visible and promoted based off of favorable phenotypes? Who gets read as leadership material and who gets read as labor? That is a very different conversation from work from home culture is a career killer for women. Careers require proximity and visibility. You want a pay raise? You want the next promotion? You want the big corner office? Guess what? You need to be there. Ladies, let's get back in the office if you want to win. Because the truth is, proximity is not neutral. Visibility is not neutral. Being in the room is not neutral. There are women whose physical presence creates access, and there are women whose physical presence creates flat out exclusion. For some women, visibility reads as leadership. For others, visibility reads as an attitude, aggression, incompetence, threat, or disposability. Throw you away. If you can't account for that, baby, you're not doing an intersectional analysis. And fun fact, you should always be doing an intersectional analysis. I got 3 foolproof ways to know whether your intersectional approach is botched. First, whether it centers black women or not. The supreme way to determine if your approach to intersectionality is botched is whether or not it centers black women. Not women of color, not white women because they're women, not trans women who are not black, black women. I know this is hard for many people because we've been taught that intersectionality centers anybody who has a marginalized identity. We've been taught that we all have layers. We're all intersectional, right? We've been taught intersectionality like some type of plug and play. And we've been taught that anything that's specific to black women should call your FOMO up to Front Street. Anything except stereotypes. The second foolproof way to know if your intersectionality approach is botched is whether or not it positions liberalism and reform as its drivers versus transformation. Now, this might get a little academic because after all, Crenshaw is not only a women's rights advocate, she's also a law professor and scholar. Like she is dual appointed at both UCLA and Columbia Schools of Law. But I'm gonna try to keep this less heady and academic and more relatable. When I say liberalism and reform, I don't mean the Democrats are liberal type of liberalism. Fun fact, the Democrats are not liberals. but anyway, I don't mean bipartisan liberalism. I mean liberalism as a way of thinking about injustice and inequity in society. I mean liberalism as an ideology that emphasizes reformation versus transformation. For example, let's take one component of my own profession. For example, I'm a master trainer, a 20+ year career as a facilitator, racial equity long before George Floyd died. Have I been leading companies through internal transformation efforts? So let's say that the office has a racism problem. So their response to the racism problem is to add a diversity training. And if this sounds familiar, it's because this is exactly what happened in 2020. I can show you quite a few proposals to companies back then who came to me wanting to do the work. So my proposals were my very standard full scope of transformation. More companies that I worked with before George Floyd got killed would opt for the fuller scope of transformation. But after George Floyd got killed and the country learned that racism was a problem, well over half only opted for trainings. Train staff, align staff on race and racism. We don't need the deeper work just yet because first we need to get our staff aligned. And often their leadership was not even in these trainings. That is reform without transformation. Why? Because the training might tweak a behavior here and there, or at least make the company look responsive, but training staff doesn't necessarily institutionally change who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets protected, whose complaints get believed, whose leadership style gets rewarded, whose body is read as professional, whose burnout is treated like a personal problem instead of a structural one. So the system stays mostly the same. It just gets a small adjustment, a little tweak. Also, trainings rest on a particular level, and that is interpersonal or individual. Trainings are conversations between people. And most inequities inside of jobs actually rest on the institutional or structural level, or the policy and practice level that leads to certain outcomes. You can't train a company out of racism. Just like you can't not buy enough coffee your way out of capitalism. Because racism is not primarily about the N-word or what black person did this or what white person did that. Very quickly, systems of oppression rest on 5 levels. All of them: racism, sexism, capitalism, lookism, classism. By the way, the ism of these words let you know they're systems. But anyway, they rest on about 5 levels: ideological, structural, institutional, interpersonal, and individual. Ideological is the idea. So we take racism as a system. The ideological racism is the idea or the general belief that white people are better than people of any other race, thus have the right to control them. And that idea gets rooted into the structures and the systems of society that make the outcomes favor white people. So the system and that systematic racism then becomes rooted in our institutional policies and practices. And then that trickles down into interpersonal dynamics. And then that becomes embodied by the individual. But trainings rest on the interpersonal and maybe the individual level. So when the problem is structural and institutional, you can't address that problem on the level of interpersonal. That is why trainings don't work, to change systems and policies and practices inside our organizations. That's why trainings alone don't work. I should say that. Because you don't address that on another level and expect the problem to be solved. So cool, all the staff got trained, but they go back to work inside of structural and institutional levels of oppression that are unchanged. But we hire DEI officers. Yes, you hired probably one person tasked with overhauling a system. And many places of employment didn't even give that person an office in the sense of staff and decision-making power. So you hired one person who essentially became the person that everybody came and complained to about all of the problems around the structures and the systems at work. So what happened in a year or two? As of early 2026, thousands of DEI roles in the federal government and corporate America have been eliminated. Federal DEI staff were placed on paid leave and laid off following the early 2025 executive orders. Numerous companies that are not part of the federal government are dismantling and have dismantled entire DEI departments, resulting in over, back then when this was written, 2,600 job cuts across various sectors since 2023. That number is far higher now. And that's because nothing about the DEI officer role was positioned as structural. It was a plug and play and easily able to be removed. This is what I mean when I say your intersectional approach is botched if it centers liberalism and reform as its driver. DEI officers were the intervention or implementation, and it made relatively small tweaks to fundamentally unjust system. It preserved the overarching structure, and as a result, it posed little to no threat to the social contract. These companies still got a racism problem, still got a sexism problem, still got a fat phobia problem. By the way, in case you've forgotten, we are discussing how to determine whether your intersectional approach is botched and whether or not it positions liberalism and reform as its drivers versus transformation. I just wanted to give you a very practical and recent example of what I mean by positioning liberalism and reforms as drivers or motivators versus transformation. DEI officers were never designed to transform shit. Now back to Emma Grede. See, Emma Grede and botched intersectionality don't ask what systems need to be transformed. They ask, how can more people succeed inside the same system? How can we get more DEI directors and make them successful? By the way, Emma Grede would have made a perfect DEI director. She talked that perfect bullshit. Instead of asking why is this workplace built in a way that rewards proximity so unevenly, why are care, disability, race, class, and gender punished differently here? Let's pause here. Care, disability, race, class, and gender being punished differently. Care is punished differently inside of a botched intersectional approach. A white woman working from home to care for children might be seen as balancing it all or prioritizing family, especially if she's wealthy. Black women doing the same might be seen as less committed, less ambitious, or unreliable, especially if she is poor or working class. Same caregiving need, different story attached to it. Disability is punished differently inside of a botched intersectional approach. A white employee disclosing ADHD may be framed as innovative, fast thinking, unconventional. Insert 90% of Silicon Valley right here. A Black employee with ADHD might be denied that softer narrative and instead be read through existing racial stereotypes about disorder, attitude, or incompetence. Same condition, different social reading. Class, social class changes how disability is lived. A middle class person with anxiety might get therapy, flexible work, a diagnosis, language, a soft landing. A working class person with anxiety may get no language, no time off, no support, and may just be read as unstable or unable to keep up. We see this in the disproportionate number of Black boys diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder compared to their white peers, often more frequently than anxiety disorders. This trend is driven by systematic bias and racial stereotypes. They interpret these behaviors as willful defiance rather than anxiety. How is this a class issue, though? I'm glad you asked. Higher diagnosis rates are linked to Black boys in lower income, marginalized communities. Those boys eventually grow up to be men with jobs, sometimes working class men with anxiety, and they may get no language, no time off, no support, and may be read as unstable or unable to keep up. Same distress, different material outcomes. Why y'all don't think that Negroes have anxiety? Now, somewhat unrelated. I don't know if you know, but I was a professor at Columbia in the School of Social Work for 8 years. And one of the biggest ways I saw this happen was with accommodation letters and the Office of Disability Services. It was deeply racialized. And I would argue that, well, social work is more women anyway, but white women, my white women students, baby, they have been trained from young on how to use them disability letters. And one day, I ain't gonna lie, I was in a rare moment, relatively unprepared for class, so I decided to just have a conversation. And I'm glad I did. What emerged was a stark racial line. Black kids have disability letters. White kids have disability letters. But the way in which they know how to use them disability letters and the lack of guilt that white kids, I ain't gonna say kids because it was graduate level, so some of them was older than me, but rarely. It came out along racial lines to the point, and remember, these people in my class were eventually gonna be colleagues in this field of social work. And one, I would never forget this student, because he went to Morehouse. He acknowledged feeling ashamed to use his ODS letter to get more time on his tests in all his classes. And this white girl looked at him and was like, "You are crazy, because baby, I use this letter left and right." As a professor, if I still had access to my Columbia email address and I pulled up all of the emails that have come to my email address from the Office of Disability Services that have started with, essentially, "We thank you in advance for letting this student get more time," I could have given all the class more time. I could have said, "Oh, turn in this assignment next week." Students with, typically white students who had disability letters, didn't take that extended time as it. They would then also use their ODS accommodation to get more time on time I already extended. And rarely, if ever, I don't want to say never, did a black student also use their letter to get more time on top of time. So I would get a very popular thing that most, I don't know, no other school, but most Columbia professors can talk about is students will use expired ODS letters and the Office of Disability Service. And I think a lot of this is because no institution wants a disability discrimination lawsuit. Nobody. No. And I'm not gonna lie, I think a lot of it has to do with I find that white people, they know about disability services. They know about the Americans with Disability Act. They know about institutional disability services, and nobody wants a disability lawsuit or a discrimination claim. So Columbia typically because I would be like, what's the point of even having dates on these letters if y'all gonna send professors emails thanking them in advance for letting the student use an expired disability letter while they're waiting for their current one to be approved? Thanking me in advance. Baby, when I say that burned my grits. And then we have ableist claims. When somebody like me say, so talk to me about how you know how to use these letters, but when it comes to doing the very practical operational shit, like get your your new letter before the old one expired, all of a sudden you have a disability and that disability prevents you from being responsible. And then we won't have to talk about responsibility inside of the disability thing. And I think a lot of why this happens is because by and large in the US, when we talk about disability, we talk about class too. And when we talk about class, we talk about race. And white people have disability on lock. So the white girl was like, I have no qualms about essentially weaponizing her disability letter with professors, with her, capstone, where where they do their service work to get their hours. She said she learned very early. And that's another thing. I mean, I never planned on talking about this, but I see, even when kids are young, white parents, they don't have no problem getting their kid an ILP. It's typically black families that's like, I don't want my child labeled. Then white people get them ILPs, IEPs, and they get all them services that come with them IEPs. Unapologetic. Black folk, we don't want the stigma attached to IEP. Instead of looking at the IEP or the ILP, for those who don't know, individualized learning plan, or individualized education plan. But white people are clear that IEPs come with services. Black people are more concerned about the stigma attached to their child having an IEP or an ILP. And typically the students who eventually became my Columbia students with disability services letters were the kids who started off with IEPs. Same distress, different material outcomes. And this, it's not just people who receive services that navigate these systems and have anxiety disorders and have IEPs. It's also service providers who have masterfully learned how to use documentation, because they even make it more neutral. Like, we place heavy emphasis on what an IEP means for our child. White people look at it as a relative, and it's because of their skin tone. They're allowed to just look at it as a neutral document that grants my child access. The average white person, I would argue, is not typically running around here worried about a stigma attached to their child's having an IEP. And that is one way that class changes how disability is lived. Gender also changes the punishment. A man who is blunt or socially unusual may be read as eccentric or brilliant. A woman with similar traits may be read as cold, rude, socially off-putting, or lacking emotional intelligence. Same presentation, different consequence. We could look at emails by gender and see this. Men tend to adopt a more aggressive, more competitive, and direct styles in their emails. Their emails tend to be shorter, containing more fear words and fewer personal details. Women often use a more supportive and conversational tone, incorporating like emoticons and exclamation points, for example, and expressions of appreciation. And this is not looked at twice. Even if people's bodies interpret male written emails as rude, but women who email like men, they are typically reprimanded. And I have a very interpersonal example. I have a colleague who worked, I don't know, she don't work at DOH anymore, but where I used to be the lead trainer. And I didn't really know her. It was probably my first or second week, but I would get emails from her. And my brain unconsciously is short-circuiting because her emails are direct. And it's like, some was short-circuiting because it was like a man was writing emails, but I knew it was coming from her. And I made the mistake of asking her about that in the kitchen. And when I say she put me in my place so damn fast, she says, Arandrian, I am the chief of staff to the commissioner of the largest public health department in the country. I don't have time for exclamation points and soft language. I got to get this out. And she asked me to my face, if I was a man, would you even be asking me this question? And you know what? I would not have. I would have been so used to short, direct, almost curt emails from a man, but it was just like, but it's you and you're Southern. And she was like, I don't have time to be super polite. I send out 5 times more emails than the average person in this agency. And I have to write on behalf of the commissioner, not on behalf of myself. I don't have time to be curt. I don't have time to be soft and sweet. Say less. But I do want to pause right here and say something that might piss people off. I'm going to get off track a little bit. I'm going to be brass tacks. When it comes to care, disability, and race and gender being punished differently, a way I see this play out in real life is white people and the weaponization of neurodivergence. And I know I'm not supposed to talk about disability. I'm not supposed to critique it. They're going to say I'm ableist. It's almost like neurodivergence is the new racism for white folk. And there's also this thing where I find that white people rush to own neurodivergence, like this rush to stake claims to things like seeing patterns and engage in socially and authentic and non-performative ways, because I just can't with the others, with the neurotypical people. And I ain't gonna lie, I also find that it creates a binary so that they can shit on people labeled neurotypical. And in true whiteness embodied by white people fashion, it's like they have to take people who have been assigned neurotypical and make neurodivergence better and make the other inauthentic and fake. I see this so often in person and so often on social media where neurodivergent, particularly white people, sure, some non-white people are in this argument, have to make neurotypical people inauthentic and fake, and they are authentic. And it's very interesting to witness what feels like someone needing an oppression. And be clear, whiteness changes how disability is interpreted, protected, narrated, even redeemed. Period. And when whiteness is embodied by white bodies, that can make neurodivergence more legible as innocence and complex or exceptional, while blackness often don't get that same interpretive generosity. Quite frankly, some white people are using neurodivergence as like this new master explanation for social difficulty, for harm, for misunderstanding, for exclusion in ways that can overshadow race, that can flatten structural difference, or that positions them as newly central to the language of oppression. It is why I say I feel like it's the new racism for white people. And that is botched as fuck. I'm not sure it's intersectionality, but it's botched. I said I was going to get off topic. I don't know if it's intersectionality, but it's botched. And what this weaponization of neurodivergence can look like is like explanation becoming exoneration. A person saying I'm autistic, I have ADHD, I'm neurodivergent. And instead of that being context, it becomes unspoken. Therefore, I should not be held fully accountable for harm, domination, or repeated impact. And that is weaponization. It's not, please understand me. It's like, but my diagnosis should end this conversation because I'm neurodivergent, and that's why that happened. The end. It makes vulnerability become this moral shield. Somebody uses neurodivergent language to position themselves as the most fragile, the most misunderstood, the most in need of care, even when other people are dealing with racialized, gendered, or classed harm that has more structural force. That is weaponization. Because at that point, neurodivergence is not just context for or explanation for. It is a shield against decentering. It is a shield against accountability. And so some people might say, well, what about black people who do this? I want to say, stop with the whataboutism. And secondly, I said this earlier in the video, you don't need one white body in the room for whiteness to lead the meeting. And when it comes to a black neurodivergent person performing whiteness, I'd like to remind them that whiteness gets interpretive grace. Like a white neurodivergent person might be read as overwhelmed and very literal and socially awkward and who needs support. Like they may get this grace that they are struggling to communicate and they are unintentionally hurtful. But the black person experiencing similar difficulty might be read as rude, aggressive, funny acting, incompetent, very hostile, unprofessional, unsafe. So when white people engage neurodivergence discourse without naming how whiteness shapes whose neurodivergence gets softened and who gets punished, that can become weaponized discourse. And I hate to see a black neurodivergent person caping for weaponized discourse, because that makes the conversation become, please understand my brain, but bypassing whose brain gets humanized in the first place. And that's a very real distinction. Now, what I've discussed here is all the reformist, half-cocked and botched ways to address what should be transformation. And that's part of why intersectionality feels botched when I was witnessing Emma Grede. Intersectionality is just not about adding more people into the picture. It's about asking how systems create different types of vulnerability in the first place. Intersectionality seeks to transform the entire system, call the whole thing into question. And the last way to tell whether your intersectionality is botched is whether it views equality as expansive versus restrictive. Now, when we say equality, I know that this, Crenshaw's theory predates this whole equity versus equality conversation. Like, I'm not sure what Dr. Crenshaw would say about equity being a more current term, but I will continue to use equality as I discuss this. So restrictive, which Dr. Crenshaw means, is it treats equality as a process and downplays the significance of outcomes. So if you ever been in a workshop and probably somebody who was not black, maybe, I don't know, they might have been a person of the global majority. They say, and we're like, so what group agreements would you like, would we like for our time together? And they say, assume good intent. You ain't gonna never hit it in one of my workshops because that's restrictive. It views equality as a process. So assume good intent. Assume my process was good. Assume my intent was good. But that does not, but that downplays the significance of the impact and the outcome of your intent. But when we start talking about a restrictive view as equality as a process, racism as a process versus outcomes resulting from racism as, markers of racism. And this is botched. Intent outweighs impact in this botched view. But in my real life, impact outweighs intent, which means how it lands on people. And again, that's why I hate the group agreement, assume good intent. Girl, what? Whiteness be gone. I will not assume a damn thing because outcomes matter. Outcomes matter. Now, expansive view prioritizes outcomes and impact regarding equality. Racism is defined and marked by outcomes. And with the expansive view, impact outweighs intent. A restrictive view of equality says, as long as the door is technically open, that's equality. Our intent was good. We created a process. The door is open. You might be a woman, but you can also get through the door. It's not closed. An expansive view says, if the outcomes are still wildly unequal, then something is wrong. Sarandra, this is too heady. What the fuck do you mean? Okay. All right. Let's take two everyday examples, school and work. So let's take school, the classroom. The restrictive view says the teacher gave every student the same instructions. So that's fair. The expansive view, however, says if half the students leave confused because the instructions only work for the kids who absorb information well audio-visually, then something about the setup is not actually equal. The school system as a whole, because not simply placing the onus on the teachers, needs to equitably incorporate other learning modalities into its curriculum besides just audiovisual learning. Modalities like kinesthetic, for example, physical movement, touch, and hands-on activity, also building models, science experiments, role-playing, that kind of thing. Modalities like tactile learning, so the sense of touch, physical manipulation, beads, blocks, beads, sensory bends, things like that. Then let's take a workplace. The restrictive view says everybody is allowed to apply for the promotion. That's essentially what Emma Grede would say. The expansive view says if the same kind of people keep getting promoted and the other people keep getting passed over, then the problem is not solved just because the application was technically open to everybody. See how that expansive view focuses on outcomes? Who gets promoted? The inequitable or restrictive organization would say the application was open to everybody. I once read this thing where an orchestra was accused of continuing to hire men for the orchestra, although women kept trying out. So they implemented this screening process where the judges couldn't see who was playing their instrument. So they were having these orchestra tryouts and they put up a partition so that the people making the selections couldn't see who was playing. They had people remove their shoes so they wouldn't hear the people walking across the floor of the orchestra stage. And magically, once the audition process was screened, the number of women rose significantly. I chose that example because it shows that a system can say, we choose the best instrumentalists and still be deeply shaped by bias. Then once a partition goes up, and once gendered cues like shoes or gendered signals like that are removed, the outcomes change. To hell with your assumed good intent. What is up with your impact? What is up with who you are choosing to be in this orchestra? That says something important. The process was never as neutral as people said it was. And that's exactly the kind of distinction that I'm trying to make here. The restrictive view says we made the process more fair by adding a screen. This focuses on the procedure or the process. But the expansive view says, look at what happened to the outcomes once the screen was added. The fact that more women were selected tells us that bias was shaping the earlier results. This focuses on impact and outcome. Now, why this is especially useful for this Emma Grede situation and botched intersectionality? Because Emma's advice assumes something like the workplace is what it is, and women need to move through it more strategically by being visible and in proximity. But Kimberly Crenshaw's expansive lens says, wait. Before telling women to better accommodate themselves to the system, we need to ask what outcomes the system is already producing and for whom. In other words, Emma's focus on how women should move through the room, and Crenshaw's framework asks what the room is already doing to different women, specifically Black women. And that is part of what makes Emma Grede's framework feel so botched to me. It treats workplace visibility and proximity as though the process is broadly available and broadly useful to women, but an intersectional lens, an intersectional analysis would look at outcomes. Who actually benefits from being seen? Who gets promoted by this proximity that we all should be chasing? Who gets protected by office culture? And who gets drained and scrutinized or punished by it? Now I want to talk a bit about the misuse of and the colonization of intersectionality. That's one of my favorite things to talk about when it comes to intersectionality, the colonization of intersectionality. Now, when I say misuse, I don't necessarily mean Emma Grede sat down and said, let me intentionally misuse intersectionality today. Again, Emma Grede don't even use the word intersectionality, probably. That's not what I mean. Misuse is a little more sneaky and savvy than that, and much more polished than that. Misuse often looks like you invoke the broad category of women, which is what Emma Grede does, while actually speaking to a very particular kind of woman. You say women when you mean women who are already legible to power. Women whose visibility is likely to be read as competence. Women whose body, whose tone, whose accent, whose dress, whose demeanor are not immediately coded as a problem. And that matters. Because when somebody with Emma Grede's symbolic power says women, but the real beneficiary of that vice is a narrower slice of women, intersectionality is being misused. I want to be clear. Some people's autobiographies get to become policy. Some people's survival story and survival strategy becomes guidance in the manuals. Some people's personal route to how they got to where they were becomes moral instruction. And then all of a sudden, women who can't or do not follow these people's paths are made to be unserious or less ambitious, less disciplined, less worthy of advancement, when really they might just be navigating entirely different structures or risk. And then we got the colonization of intersectionality. What I think happens in conversations like this is not just misuse, but it is sometimes a kind of colonization. I don't mean Emma Grede invented something or stole a phrase in some crude or cartoonish way. I mean something more subtle and in my opinion, more common. I mean the process by which a radical framework created to name interlocking systems of harm gets absorbed into mainstream, elite, or aspirational just discourse and stripped of its political force. Words mean things. Language born from struggle gets stripped of its teeth and repurposed in service of these elite narratives. It gets prettied up. It gets flattened. It gets made more marketable, more palatable, and less disruptive. According to Elisa Lopez, intersectionality is being taken away from its roots and it's being reappropriated by white feminism. Similar to the colonization of bodies and land belonging to people of color throughout history, intersectionality has been taken from its originator, a Black woman, and has been reappropriated in order to serve the interests of those in economic, political, and social power. Words mean things. And the change of the words meaning takes away its power, and that in and of itself is an act of colonization. So instead of intersectionality being a tool to ask who is being crushed, where racism, sexism, class, disability, labor, motherhood, and desirability overlap, now you can have a light-skinned Black woman born and raised in the UK, married to a wealthy white man from Sweden, in a boardroom, speaking in the name of women, while reproducing advice that works best for women already nearest to power. That's not intersectionality. Intersectionality was not created to help powerful people sound nuanced. It wasn't created so corporations could nod toward complexity. It wasn't created to turn structural violence into the diversity language. It was created to help us understand how systems work together to produce specific kinds of vulnerability. But that's not the right word. Misuse or dilution at most. Now, let me say why colonization is the best word. Because I know some people would prefer something cleaner and less jarring, like misuse or dilution. But I think colonization gets us closer to the actual violence of what's happening to radical ideas. Colonization is not just borrowing, it's taking, it's occupying, it is restructuring, renaming, it is neutralizing. It's making something serve a different power arrangement than the one that it came from. And that's what happens when intersectionality travels upwards into elite discourse without its original political demands intact. Because again, intersectionality demands things of us. And Emma Grede's commentary participates in that process. And Emma Grede's Blackness doesn't automatically make the take intersectional. Because there is still this assumption that if a Black woman is speaking from lived experience, that should automatically count as an intersectional perspective by default. No, I said this already. An identity does not equal an analysis. I have already talked about how we should learn that back when George Floyd died, and y'all went to putting all these people of color in the DEI director roles simply because they wasn't white. And next thing you know, they're still doing their job, centering the white gaze, still rooted in whiteness, still without a critical and intersectional approach. But they wasn't white. A Black woman can absolutely have a perspective shaped by racialized and gendered experience. That does not mean that her perspective is automatically accountable to poor women, disabled women, queer women, fat women, immigrant women, dark-skinned women, women with children, women without elite polish, women with caregiving responsibilities, women whose English is marked differently, women whose bodies don't move through institutions as easily. And this matters especially when the woman in question is extraordinarily wealthy, conventionally attractive, highly networked, up in the room with the Kardashians child, globally visible, and operating inside of elite business ecosystems. Now, this is beyond just Emma Grede. This is bigger than just me using Emma Grede as a live wire to have this conversation. This happens all the time. We are living in an era where institutions and public figures are very, very comfortable with the language of inclusion, but much less comfortable with the actual demands of structural thinking. So what happens then? People use broad words like women, diversity, representation, equity. Baby, they say it all right. They say it all correctly. Visibility, authenticity, intersectionality. But then they fill those words with much narrower assumptions. That's how you end up with advice for women that is really for high-performing corporate women with enough social protection to benefit from visibility. That's how you end up with advice for Black women that's really a relatively small slice of Black women who can convert legibility into mobility. That's how you end up with inclusive language delivering exclusionary outcomes. But because the language sounds expansive, many people miss the narrowing that has just happened. This is why the misuse of intersectionality matters. Because once the word gets flattened, people can feel seen without actually being considered. And that's one of the most insidious things that can happen in public discourse. To feel named, but not actually held in the analysis, to hear your category spoken, but not your conditions understood. That's a very real type of erasure. A more honest version coming from Emma Grede might have sounded like, in the industries of power structures I know best, I know that physical proximity is still often rewarded in many ways leaders won't admit. It would have been nice if she'd have said that. It would have been nice if she'd have said that reality may help some women advance, but I also know that visibility and office presence don't work the same way for all women, and many workplaces remain unequal, racialized, ableist, class, and punishing, or something to that effect. That would have been so nice. It would have been nice if she'd have said, so rather than telling women to simply come back and be seen, we should be asking why institutions still reward proximity in such even ways. Why being in the office is rewarded over working from home. Now that would have been a different conversation, because that version doesn't pretend all women encounter the workplace equally. It don't turn one woman's rise into a universal formula. It doesn't flatten structural difference into like this hustle advice, because that's very much what I was getting from Emma. Hustle girl. It names the system. It names the unevenness, and it names the cost. In my mind, that is much closer to what intersectional thinking would require. Emma Grede's comments were not just controversial, they were revealing. Not only because of what she said about women, work proximity, and ambition, not just because of that, but because of what her statement exposed about how easily intersectionality gets flattened once it enters elite success discourse. You could have a Black woman speaking about women. You could have a marginalized identity visibly present and still not have an intersectional analysis. They are not the same thing. And that distinction matters now more than ever. Because if we're not careful, We gonna keep mistaking representation for rigor. Hear me and hear me well. Representation is not intersectionality. That's the distinction that I needed us to hold through this whole video. Just because a Black woman is speaking does not mean the analysis is accounting for layered inequality. Just because the speaker belongs to a marginalized group doesn't mean their framework is structurally honest. It doesn't even mean they have a well thought out framework. Just because somebody can say as a woman or as a Black woman doesn't mean they're actually speaking from a politic that holds the woman most punished by overlapping systems. And this matters because Emma's Blackness does rhetorical work in public. Like, it really does. Whether people consciously realize it or not, her identity can lend like a kind of credibility to what she says about women in work. It can make people think, well, she understands marginalization. Well, she must know what it's like to face barriers. Well, this isn't just some rich executive talking. She started off as a poor girl in London delivering newspapers at 12. She has to know what she's talking about. But here's where we got to get more precise. All Blackness is not read the same. All Blackness is not created equal. Emma Grede is not a dark-skinned, phenotypically unmistakable Black woman moving through the world in the same way that those other Black women do. She's a biracial Black woman whose racial presentation is more ambiguous, more absorbable, more palatable to many institutions and audiences than the Blackness of many other women. That don't make her not Black. Let me be clear. That's not the argument. So before you even think to get in my comments, even remotely suggesting that I'm questioning this lady's Blackness, don't. What I'm saying is that Blackness is not experienced uniformly, and it's not rewarded uniformly. This is where those who understand nuance will be separated from those who don't. Some forms of Blackness are more easily welcomed into elite spaces. Some forms of Blackness are more easily branded as aspirational. Some forms of Blackness are more readily folded into beauty culture and corporate culture and luxury culture and founder culture. If you don't account for the differences in how Black women are read, then you start treating Black womanhood as one flat category. And that's already the very opposite of intersectional. So no, this is not really just about Emma Grede. It's about what happens when complexity gets flattened, sold back to us, and called the truth. And that is the framework drop. That is a cultural autopsy. If this video gave you language for something you've been sensing but couldn't quite name, let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in public conversations around power, identity, and the deeper patterns underneath what people say, subscribe. Because that is what we do here. I'm the Ignant Intellectual. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time. Peace.